We're going to look today at the life of Adoniram Judson. Lord willing, I'm going to try to look tomorrow at the lives of his three wives, two of which gave their life for the service of God. And we have a real blessing, and that is a book called The Lives of the Three Mrs. Judsons that is available now through Gutenberg Press, free download. And ladies, you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't download this and read it. It's the life of three ladies who gave up everything, every convenience in life, for the love of their Adoniram Judson, and for the love of the lost souls in a thankless society. What we simply do not have time to go through all the details of what day-to-day life was like for these ladies, but this book does, and it uses a lot of their diary entries, a lot of their own words, and the life of Mrs. Ann Hasseltine Judson, Sarah Boardman Judson, and Emily Chubbuck Judson, and it is a challenging book. It is a book that brings out emotions within when you see what they did, as does the life of Adoniram Judson. To the Golden Shore is an excellent biography of the life of Judson. You may have read that or have to read it, or that's mistermed, get to read it, I would say. Adoniram Judson, much to cover and not enough time. So, he was born August 9th, 1788, and he died April 12th, 1850, at the age of 61 years old. He was married 3 times, 2 wives died, and all 3 were dedicated, surrendered servants of God. 5 firsts of Adoniram Judson's ministry. He was the first U.S. missionary to foreign soil. He produced the first dictionary in the Burmese language. He was the first to translate the Bible into the Burmese language. He was the first U.S. candidate and appointee to a foreign mission society. And he was the first appointee to a Baptist mission society. You say, well, I thought Adoniram Judson was a Baptist, and he was, but he was not originally commissioned by, he was not a Baptist when he was first commissioned. He became a Baptist by conviction of reading the Scripture. Adoniram Judson had 14 children, and again, we mentioned the 3 wives. And let's give the overview like this. In September of 1813, Judson arrived in Burma. In 1850, there were 276 missionaries in Burma. That's in 37 years. Adoniram Judson was born in Malden, Massachusetts, in the parsonage of the Congregational Church of that town. The address was 146 South Main Street. Happened to be the oldest house in town. His father was the congregational pastor in Malden, and they moved from Malden to another town in Massachusetts, Windham, when Judson was just 2 years old. And they were there for 11 years. Judson read at the age of 3. One year during his youth, he was extremely sick for a year, nearly died. No school for that year. And he recovered from that and made up that year of school and more. In 1804, Judson enrolled in Rhode Island College. Now, that was the first Baptist college of the day in America. He enrolled there. Later, Rhode Island College would become Brown University, Ivy League school now, but began as Rhode Island College. And he enrolled there at the age of 16. And when he got there, due to the knowledge that he had gained, he enrolled as a sophomore. By that time, in Rhode Island College, you did not have to be a Christian to enter. So the stipulation of a profession of faith was not a requirement any longer at Rhode Island College. And we're going to look at another college in Maine that began also by Baptists. Soon after its founding, it dropped that stipulation as well. It's named Colby College. And Colby College in Maine will play into, as well as Rhode Island College here, will play into the life of Adoniram Judson and his co-workers. So he gets into college, and we said he didn't have to be a Christian to enter because Judson was not really at this time, and he chose the wrong friends at school. One of his close friends was named Jacob Eames, Eames, who was a deist, and deists would be familiar and be sympathetic to Christianity in general. They would be rejecting of any supernatural. So they would reject verbal inspiration. They would reject things like the bodily resurrection, the miraculous of Scripture. Jacob Eames became his friend there in school. In 1807, Judson graduated as valedictorian of his class, and that was his goal. So he is extremely well-read and extremely smart, and did excellent academically at school. So his first foray into life was to go back to Massachusetts, and in Plymouth, he opened and operated a grammar school. And during that time, he wrote 2 books and had them published. First book was titled The Elements of English Grammar. The second book that he wrote and had published was called Young Ladies' Arithmetic. As opposed to the arithmetic that men get to do, I don't know. Maybe it was illustrated like with floral prints and rainbows and sugar and spice. Maybe they were like part of the arithmetic to help the ladies along when they wanted to cry when they're trying to figure out division. Or decimals. I think he probably had to add a lot of extra stuff when algebra hit. And geometry, he just skipped that section. So it's like, young ladies were skipping geometry. Instead, he maybe taught them like regular ounces and fluid ounces okay. Anyway, I don't know. Maybe you can find that on Gutenberg Project and tell me what young ladies' arithmetic was. So enough of that for Judson. He got on the Robert Fulton steamboat to go to New York City in rebellion. He wanted to take a different avenue in life. and wanted to be in the theater. And so there he went, roamed the streets, became a vagabond, lived on the wild side. After a time like that, he realized that that type of a life was not what it was all cracked up to be. So he leaves New York City on horseback, heading toward Connecticut. En route, he stops at an inn, and certainly an interesting account that we have there. There's different accounts of it, but one is the experience of an atheist in a country inn. And this is one of the many intriguing stories from Judson's life. The sun had set and the darkness was settling in as the young atheist tied up his horse at a country inn. Tired from a day's journey, he stepped inside to inquire as to a room for the night. Apologetically, the landlord explained that only one room was vacant, but this room was next door to the room of a man who was extremely ill and probably dying. The young atheist blurted out, "I'll take that room. Death has no terrors for me. See, I'm an atheist." The young man turned the key in his door with a feeling of pride. After all, he was a college graduate with his own philosophy of life, which excluded God. That night, however, the young man, Adoniram Judson, would discover that human philosophies cannot answer the questions posed by impending death. Judson unpacked his bags and endeavored to sleep, but sleep eluded him. The walls were very thin, and all night he could hear clearly the groans and cries of despair coming from the next room. Judson thought to himself, "The poor fellow evidently is dying in terror. I suppose I should go to his assistance, but what could he say that would help him?" He shivered at the very thought of going into the presence of the dying man. What help would atheism offer a dying man? Judson knew he could offer the man no hope, no peace, or encouragement, for atheism has none of those ingredients. All night long, the dying agony continued, and as Judson lay upon his bed, his life floated before him. He had grown up in a Christian home. His father, a congregational minister, had always prayed that his son would one day preach the gospel. Judson, as a boy, displayed unusual abilities. He was only 3 years old when he learned to read under the tutelage of his mother. As an older youth, he was appalled at the thought of using his brilliance in such a dull occupation as the ministry. The pride of his heart gave him visions of being a great orator, perhaps a second Homer, writing immortal poems. Judson was not only inordinately ambitious, he was also openly atheistic. It was during the early years of the 19th century, while in college, that French infidelity swept over the country. With only 3 or 4 exceptions, all of the students at Yale were avowed infidels, and they preferred to call each other by the names of leading infidels such as Tom Paine or Voltaire instead of their own names. In the class, just above that of Judson, was a young man by the name of Ernest who was acceptably gifted, witty, and clever, and an outspoken atheist. An intimate friendship developed between these two brilliant young men, with the result that Judson also became a bold exponent of infidelity, to the extreme sadness of his father and mother. When his father sought to argue with him, Judson quickly demonstrated his intellectual superiority. But what he had no answer for was his mother's tears and solemn warnings. So the tears of his mother, the faith of his father, his spiritual rebellion, and now the cries of a soul nearing eternity next door all came to play in Adoniram's heart and mind that night. As he tried to compose himself, the dreadful cries from the next room continued. He pulled the blankets over his head, but still heard the awful sounds and shuddered. How foolish he was. Finally, all became quiet in the next room. At dawn, having had no sleep, he arose and inquired of the innkeeper concerning his fellow lodger. "He's dead." Dead, replied Judson. Do you know who he was? Yes, the innkeeper answered. He was a college graduate. Judson realized, graduate of the same college that he was. What was his name? Judson realized when the innkeeper replied his name was Ernest Jacob Eames. Judson was overwhelmed by the news that the young man who died was his college friend who led him into infidelity. For many hours, the words dead, lost, lost kept ringing in his ears. Judson left the inn, mounted his horse, headed toward home, toward his mother's tears and his father's faith. Arriving home, Judson begged his father and mother to help him find a faith that would stand the test of life and of death, of time and eternity. And one day, the years of intellectualism and atheism crumbled before the saving power of Jesus Christ, etc. The story of an atheist at the country inn. After that night, Judson returned home with a changed attitude. He took a trip to Boston, went to a private library, and found a book by the author Thomas Boston. And the book was entitled Boston's Fourfold State. And in this book, Thomas Boston describes depravity, redemption, new birth, and heaven. And this book was used to challenge Judson toward the need for his new birth. After his conversion, his dad encouraged Judson to try to get into Andover Seminary. This seminary had recently been formed in reaction to the liberalism and Unitarianism of Harvard. As we mentioned, Yale was thoroughly atheistic, so was Harvard. And so Andover Seminary here in Massachusetts was to be founded in opposition to that complete atheism. Now, we took a little bit of time and read about Henry Dunster, didn't we? First president of Harvard College. Baptist by conviction. Lost his job because of his conviction. Harvard was started as a preacher training school. And think of what 150, 175 years did to Harvard. So Andover was started. Again, Andover is not a Baptist seminary. Congregationalists would be attracted to Andover. And under this conviction from his mother's tears, his father's faith, Thomas Boston's book, Depravity, Redemption, New Birth in Heaven, Judson is converted. And he's at Andover, and there are several professors that he meets there. Leonard Woods, Gardner Spring, and Edward Dorr Griffin. We'll talk about some of his professors here in a little bit. He's very different when he is at Andover Seminary. His conversion made Adoniram Judson a new creature. While he's at Andover Seminary, he hears a sermon. The sermon is entitled A Star in the East. And you have a little bit there about that sermon in the handout. This sermon is illustrative of the point that one sermon can change a person's life. God can use one sermon with a person whose heart is right and whose ears are open and whose will is surrendered to change a person's life and to give them a call. And that sermon is A Star in the East. You can find the entire text for this sermon online. It was preached by a man by the name of Claudius Buchanan, and it was preached in the parish church of St. James, Bristol, England, Sunday, February 26, 1809, and it was such a challenging message that it was sent to America. And Judson got this sermon and read it. And for 6 months, Judson was convicted about the contents of this sermon. Claudius Buchanan, who was he? He had been to India. He was a British agent, and so with that British background, he was actually an agent for the British East India Company. So he had the freedom to travel, and he had the freedom to see the needs and see the lives of the people in India. And second paragraph, at the age of 16, Buchanan entered the University of Glasgow, but left 2 years later, worked in various positions, enrolled in Queen's College, University of Cambridge. At the age of 29, he earned his BA degree, became an ordained deacon in the Church of England. He was excellent at mathematics and classics. Next paragraph, he was ordained a priest in the Church of England in 1796, got an appointment as an East India Company chaplain. Next paragraph, in India, Buchanan and William Carey became friends. Buchanan and the Fort William College provost, David Brown, recommended that Carey be appointed as professor at Fort William College. So we see Buchanan's interaction with William Carey. Last paragraph. In 1807, Fort William College, the position of vice provost, several faculty appointments, was discontinued. As a chaplain in the East India Company, Buchanan could participate in religious efforts. 1807 to 1808, he toured South and West India, during which time he investigated Hindu social practice. Of particular interest to Buchanan was the translation of the Bible into the languages of India for the purpose of missionary outreach. Returned to England in 1808, published notes of his travel in India. But in 1809, he preached A Star in the East. First full paragraph, back page. In 1809, the sermon, The Star in the East, Buchanan reveals his long-held view that Christianity should pervade the world. Worldwide missions. The similarity of Buchanan's theology, particularly of his Bible translation, as a means of Christian missions, to William Carey's theology and practice is evident. The popularity of Buchanan's sermon is documented and was reprinted. And at the conclusion of the sermon, he says these 8 things. Number 1, the facility with which Christianity is propagated generally in Asia, wherever the attempt has been made. 2, the peculiar success that has attended our own endeavors to promote the religion of the Bible. 3, the conversion of illustrious persons in Asia by means of the Bible alone. Reviewing the work and the progress that William Carey's mission had done. 4, the translation of the Bible in almost all the languages of Asia, promising, as it were, a second promulgation of Christianity to the East. 7, the consent of good men in all Christian nations to promote the design. And 8, the preservation of our own country to carry out on the work amidst the ruin or infidelity of other nations. A Star in the East, Claudius Buchanan. And that sermon that was read by Judson, convicted him. For 6 months, he thought about this. And after 6 months, Star in the East, the need for the gospel, the pioneer work of William Carey, the translation work of William Carey, the brilliant, genius, and now surrendered Christian Adoniram Judson surrendered to the call and gave God his all. At Andover Seminary, there was a group of men that got together and they prayed. They had a prayer meeting, and there's a monument. There's a monument to that prayer meeting that these men, Judson, Samuel Newell, Samuel Knott, Gordon Hall, James Richards, Samuel Mills, and Luther Rice, they gathered together and they prayed for the cause of missions. And from that prayer meeting sprung some pioneer missionaries, some on the foreign field, and some, in the instance of Luther Rice, promoting missions in the States for their entire life. Faculty at Andover Seminary. I mentioned a man named Gardner Spring. He preached for over 50 years. He was a Presbyterian. He preached at the ordination of a man named Daniel Merrill. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Daniel Merrill, present at the founding of Colby College in Maine. And in the first class of Colby College in Maine was a fellow by the name of George Dana Boardman, and we'll talk about him as well. Gardner Spring was ordained, not only as a professor at Andover, but he was also pastor as well. Daniel Merrill, though, Gardner Spring was at Daniel Merrill's ordination, and in preparation for his ordination, Daniel Merrill read some questions about baptism. And he thought about those questions, and they troubled him. The practice of infant baptism did, with regard to its lack of defense in the Scripture. And so after 10 years, we find Daniel Merrill, who is ordained after 10 years, preaching series of seven sermons on the topic of baptism, and becomes a Baptist by conviction. So, Daniel Merrill in 1803 called a council for all the church members, and after the council, he and everyone that consented to the Bible view were immersed, and they formed the First Baptist Church in Sedgwick, Maine. I mentioned Edward Griffin. He was a professor in New Jersey and came to Andover to be the pulpit speech teacher. And he was among the group of fundamental Congregationalists that in Boston formed the Park Street Church. This was to stand against the Unitarianism of other churches of that day. In time, Park Street Church became the largest fundamental, not Baptist, Congregational church in Boston. It became prestigious. Edward Griffin, as a professor at Andover, noticed the guy that he wanted to take that church, the guy whose intellectual and speaking abilities would fit just perfect. Who do you think he thought and desired to take over the pastorate of this prestigious Park Street Church? It was Adoniram Judson. So Judson, as a relatively young man, was offered the most prestigious pastorate in Boston. Undoubtedly a far more comfortable life than what he would face. Judson declined, and he said this: "God has called me to another field." So these seven friends, united in prayer for world missions at Andover Seminary, on June 25th, 1810, met with congregational pastors throughout New England, and together they formed a missionary society. And the missionary society was titled the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. When that board was formed, 4 names were listed as potential missionary prospects or candidates. During these meetings that organized this American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, Judson stayed in the home of a man by the name of John Hasseltine, who happened to have a daughter named Anne, who apparently was of interest to Adoniram. They shared a common first letter of their first name. Anne was in charge of being the home hostess during this time, and the story goes that Adoniram immediately fell in love. Anne's dad, who was a congregational deacon, was an old-fashioned man, and he also did not want to give his daughter up to a man who was going to be a missionary. This is definitely, as far as America is concerned, pioneer days of missionaries. It's not like Judson could explain what they were going to go to and face. There was nothing to go to over there, nothing established. You can understand that strict old-fashioned father's concern, right? So, the men who established this American Foreign Mission Board felt that they should get some counsel and advice from the British Foreign Mission Board that had been established in 1790s by Carey, right? So Judson gets on a ship to go to London to get some advice about how to get things going with establishing and organizing the mission board. And the ship that he gets on is called the Packet. Does anybody know what happens en route? A pirate ship called the Lil, L-I-L, Invincible Napoleon, L-I-L, the Lil Invincible Napoleon, captures the Packet, Judson and others. Judson had no money, and he's trapped. And so he gets tossed into the brig of the ship. Read To the Golden Shore. Judson loses his mind some during this time, and Satan right here particularly tempts and tests and tries Judson intensely. The ship lands in France, Bayonne, France. At the time of a parade, they're going to parade their captives, put them on display, going down the streets. Judson pulls off a David, and in the midst of this parade, he fakes to be a madman. I don't know, maybe he didn't have to fake very much after spending all that time in the brig, the ship. Fakes to be a madman. He's in France, and he's hollering out and screaming out in English. Most of the people there are not understanding what he's saying. But a British businessman hears Judson's words, follows the pirates after the parade, and bribes the man in charge of the jail with money, and Judson gets released and escapes back to England. Not back to England, to England. Well, not the first thing you want to write back in your missionary prayer letter, right? In the brig, on parade, bribed to get out of jail, got to England, and found out that the British society there simply offered no help to them. And so, in 1811, in August, 8 months after he left, 8 months after he left in January, he returns to the United States with two discouraging stories. But he got back there, and apparently he went to work courting, because February 5th, 1812, he gets married to Anne Hasseltine. And another man was married the same day, Samuel Newell, married Harriet Newell. And he's a prayer partner there with Judson. February 6th, 1812, Judson is ordained, missionary ordination. Spring, Woods, and Griffin are all involved with this. 1,200 people came to his ordination time. There were high hopes and high aspirations for Adoniram Judson. The location of the ordination with relation to the College of Andover was a 12-mile difference, and numerous of the Andover seminary students walked the 12 miles to get to that service. In one service, the 1,200 people there, $6,000 was raised for missions. Luther Rice was also going to go to Burma with Judson. He raised his support in 1 week. February 19th, 1812, from Salem, Massachusetts, the ship The Caravan, sailed for India. On board were the Judsons and the Newells. Right about that time, from Philadelphia, on board the ship called the Harmony, the Halls, the Knotts, and Luther Rice sailed as well. Judson knows that his first stop is going to be in India, and he's going to meet with someone from William Carey's mission. And he knew that William Carey was a Baptist. So he wanted to be prepared for the inevitable question about Baptists and baptism that was going to come up. And so en route, Luther Rice on his ship and Judson and his wife on their ship broke out their Greek New Testaments. And they read and they studied and they looked up passages on baptism. Baptizo. What does that mean? Transliteration of the English word baptize, or vice versa. What is the definition of baptizo, baptize? How is that defined? Well, it means immerse. And when was this ordinance performed? Ever on an infant? Not in the New Testament. It seems like people that made a profession of faith were then baptized. These are the thoughts that Judson is recognizing from Scripture. By the time the ship stopped, Judson and his wife had a statement: "We are confirmed Baptists." And one of William Carey's co-workers, Joshua Marshman, baptized the Judsons by immersion. And coincidentally, Luther Rice, when he arrived off his ship, had come to the exact same conclusion. For the first 17 months on the field, Judson and his wife and their co-workers, the Newells, were just literally in a state of flux, traveling here and there. During these early months, Mrs. Newell has a baby, and it dies, and then she dies. And Samuel Newell was out on a missions excursion and was not present for either of those. Death of his baby, the death of his wife. In time, Judson and his wife found a ship going to Burma, and they went there, and that is where Judson stayed for the next 34 years. During this state of flux, Luther Rice returns to the United States, And there he promotes missions for the rest of his life. In the first year, he began visiting in churches, promoting missions, trying to form a Baptist mission society. Judson had gone over as a Congregationalist. They weren't going to send their support over for someone who turned coat on them. So Luther Rice's job was to stir up the Baptist churches and stir up their heart for missions and their desire for missions, and to get the finances necessary to send it over to keep the mission going. And so, May 1814, the First Baptist Mission Society was formed. It was titled the General Missionary Convention of the Baptist Denomination in the United States of America for Foreign Missions. Nice short name. It became known later as the Triennial Convention, which meant it was a mission that met, a meeting that met every 3 years. And during those 3 years, those on the board would approve missionary candidates, and the board would approve finances for those missionary candidates to go to their various places of service. Not a very local church concept, but it was what they knew and what they did at that time. The first president was Richard Furman. Furman University today, South Carolina. He was the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Charleston, South Carolina. Richard Furman was, and he was the first president of the Triennial Convention. The Judsons arrive in Burma to find no written language. But Claudius Buchanan talked about how that the Bible alone would be able to be used by missionaries to convert people to Christianity in the East. What a great idea, what a great concept. But there's a problem. There needs to be a written language before there's a Bible. So, from sunrise to sunset, Judson listens to a Burmese man talk for several years. Now, would you have the persistence to do something so incredibly mundane and monotonous as that? I wonder if he ever thought about the parsonage of the Park Street Church there in Boston. I wonder if he ever thought about that. Well, through this immense amount of mentally grueling work, Judson learns the language and makes a dictionary of Burmese. From the years 1813 to 1819, there's no converts. Can you imagine why? He's trying to learn language. He's trying to get this language in written form. He's writing a dictionary. Boy, he is laying a foundation, isn't he? After 10 years, they had 11 converts. He said 7 of them backslid, got away from God. During these early years, at the age of 2.5 years old, he and Anne's first baby dies. In 1816, a Burmese grammar book is finished. In 1817, news comes back. Can you imagine getting this letter? I can imagine getting this letter. Here comes a letter. Judson opens it up. It's a letter from his father that he had been immersed and became a Baptist pastor. After that, Judson begins work on the New Testament in Burmese. And at that time, his wife Anne becomes very sick. So in 1821 to 1822, Anne is forced to, for 18 months, return to America and try to recover her health. Again, this book describes day-to-day living that Ann Judson had to face. And you understand how there was the most unsanitary, uncivilized situations that faced them when they got there. And Burma, not the climate conducive to good health. So don't miss this book. Did I say that already? Okay, I wasn't sure. Anne becomes sick, but she speaks to ladies. She speaks to ladies about the need for wives, ladies to surrender and follow their husbands if God calls them to missions. And somebody sitting out there hears her named Sarah Hall. Sarah Hall responds to Ann Hasseltine Judson's challenge to Christian ladies. Sarah Hall surrenders her life. And Sarah Hall eventually, soon, will meet a student from Colby College in Maine named George Dana Boardman. They will become married. They will go to Burma as missionaries. Anne returns to Burma after 18 months. And immediately when she returns, Judson's joy is turned to great fear and problems as the Burmese-British War begins. And all British are assumed to be spies of the British government. Judson gets treated as the British, subject to death. He is drugged hand and foot for miles and thrown into prison. For over a year, periodically, he would be hung, suspended on poles. I wonder if he ever thought about the Park Street Church parson. Each day, one person in the prison camp is killed. The U.S. churches, the mission board, believes the Judsons are dead. They haven't heard from them. They just believe that they're dead. Ann Hasseltine goes to Adoniram and feeds him every day. She feeds him. Judson had hid New Testament translation, the Burmese, in a pillow. The Burmese, miraculously, took everything except that from him. That really probably was no accident, was it? Twice during this time, he has a dagger at his heart by the Burmese. And the Holy Spirit simply preserved him. The war ends. They still have the New Testament. Judson, among the British and others, when the story of what transpired, becomes somewhat of a hero after the war. And he goes on somewhat of a missions trip in the country. Is gone for a little bit. And on this trip, November 24th, 1826, he receives a letter. He opens that letter up. The last letter was good news. His dad got baptized. This letter states that exactly 1 month before, October 24th, his wife Anne had died. And early the next year, his little daughter Anna Maria also dies. 1827 to 1834, we find Adoniram Judson as a widower in somewhat of a social shell, you might say, but diving in, dedicating his time to finishing this New Testament translation, the Bible, translating the Bible into Burmese, the whole Bible in this time. He was so down, he destroyed correspondence that he had had at that time. And 1827 to 1834. In 1831, George Dana Boardman and his wife Sarah as missionaries. George Dana Boardman dies on the mission field, leaving Sarah Boardman a widow, but she stayed on the mission field as a widow. In 1834, Adoniram Judson marries Sarah Boardman, and they're married for 11 years, and they have 8 children during that time. And now, after the marriage of a second wife, who you can read about in this book called The Lives of the Three Mrs. Judsons. It's a really good book. You can see her words, her expressions. She was, all of Judson's wives were smart and gifted. They were poetic. They wrote letters. They wrote poems. His ministry flourishes again. In 1834, his marriage with Sarah, his ministry just takes off. But Sarah's health is never good, and actually Adoniram's health is never good either. They live with poor health and pain really throughout their life. Every couple months, Judson would have to take a journey on sea just to heal up. 1845, Sarah and Adoniram return to the United States. 4 of their children go along with them. 4 of their children stay back in Burma. They're going back over to the States, and they want to stir up the cause for missions, report back to the Triennial Convention. Another time I'd love to go back in history to see. Exciting time for them. Except that the ship passage to the States saw the death of Sarah. She died on the journey. 31 years passed since they left, since Judson left. He buried his wife, first wife, children. Second wife dies on the journey back. 31 years to his first furlough. He arrives in Boston at the time of the meeting of the Triennial Convention. Adoniram Judson is there. Eugenio Kincaid, another man, time permitting, we'll discuss. And the convention met, and Judson gets there to find out that the convention talked about how tight money was, and they needed to cut back on the level of support that they were sending to their missionaries. I won't surprise you when I tell you that at the end of Judson's testimony, the convention decided not to cut back, but to enlarge and reinforce their missions work and their missions giving. During this brief tour back in the States, Judson meets a novelist who happened to be a sold-out, surrendered Christian as well, named Emily Chubbuck. He meets her in Philadelphia. She was very much Judson's intellectual equal. He was 56. She was 26. She became his third wife. She had such a heart for missions and the ministry and a love for Judson and a lack of jealousy for what Judson had done that she took her ability as a novelist and turned it into the biography of Judson's second wife, Sarah Boardman Judson. Emily wrote Sarah Boardman Judson's biography during their 6-month courtship. And so, at this time, Judson leaves the 4 children in the States that he had brought over. Very common for these days of missions, for there to be missions boarding schools and to have kids come back to the States or the home area for education. He leaves the 4 children in the States and goes back to Burma with a young bride. And they had a child together. And Emily and Judson, Adoniram, are married for 5 years. until the time of his death, the age of 61. Judson takes a journey at sea. Again, he had to do this fairly regularly because of his health. His last words to Emily before he took that sea journey was this: "I may never see you again." It's as though he knew how serious his health situation was. And he was right. 3 days into his journey, Adoniram Judson dies, and they buried him at sea. The ship returns 3 months later with the word of his death. And that closes the chapter of the life of Adoniram Judson. Let me review this. 1812, 0 missionaries. 1850, 276 missionaries. So the life of Adoniram Judson. Take time to read To the Golden Shore and put that together with the lives of the 3 Mrs. Judsons, and you cannot help but be challenged by his life and his legacy.